Hello and welcome to this Edison audio interview with Daniel Koller, the lead fund manager of BB Biotech. Now, BB Biotech is a Swiss-based investor in biotechnology companies from around the world. It's got a very concentrated portfolio and some interesting holdings, including this year's headline-grabbing Moderna, which has been developing one of the main vaccines for COVID-19. Today is the 8th of December. I'm Sarah Godfrey from Edison, an analyst in the investment companies team. Good morning to you, Daniel.
Good morning to you, Sarah. Thanks for having me.
So with everyone's focus having understandably been on COVID-19 during 2020, are there things that investors might have missed in the biotech sector?
Yeah, let me start out first of all with, I think what has really grabbed, as you said, the headlines in 2020. I think that's still true and will be true as well for the foreseeable or the few quarters to come along. Meaning, I said, how will the COVID vaccines do? How will the rollout look like? So that has really, I said, I think dominated at least the headlines in 2020. And I said, the good news for us has been that Moderna, as well as its competitor actually with the mRNA vaccines, have really shown excellent results in terms of symptomatic infection reductions and I said, almost or completely reduced the risk of severe hospitalization or severe cases of COVID-19. But as you asked, I mean, I think that the sector is much broader than that, in a sense that we have seen the sector, as in the past, focusing on a couple of key areas. These are more the chronic disorders, such as cancer, such as cardiovascular, such as many of the orphans diseases, which we will quickly touch on, or I can quickly touch on. As I said, for us, I think it has been really rewarding to see, I said, a couple of very positive, I would say, late-stage clinical trial results, as well as some rather intriguing, and we can even say disruptive technology updates that we have seen throughout the year. So let me start quickly on the late stage trial. I mean, you see, the year has started off with a very positive headline for us, at least for myocardia and the cardiovascular space, which most often people don't look at much. And that was in obstructive hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, where we had seen a positive trial result or phase 3 result that led all the way to Bristol Myers Squibb acquiring actually myocardia for $12 billion. We have continued to see in other areas, like for argenx in myasthenia gravis, very positive phase 3 results. I think I said important headlines and trials that have, or that could continue even in the face of the pandemic as such, all the way down to earlier proof of concept study results, for example, for Scholar Rock in spinal muscular atrophy for an antibody that targets the myostatin pathway as such. Then I mentioned, I would say, rather platform or technologies that started off with, I would say, the genetic medicine area, where I think gene editing really made a splash. That started obviously with the Nobel Prize Award being given in chemistry in 2020 to the technology, or to the two inventors of the technology. And we have seen this now really well translate into clinical trials and first results in severe patient indication. And here I would take exemplarily CRISPR Therapeutics with, I said, very positive results in beta thalassemia or sickle cell patient, where we can pretty much speak about a cure, meaning a one-time treatment leading to cures. And what looks like, I said, similarly intriguing, I think, from platform stance, for example, was Fate Therapeutic, which we define as the third generation cell-based therapies that we have out there. So we just have the ASH ongoing these days, or starting over the weekend and continuing these days. And I think we have seen here excellent news in terms of, this iPSC. So actually the pluripotent stem cell approach that Fate uses to result really positive and intriguing early results. For example, I said in relapsed refractory B-cell lymphoma, where I said this is, I think, a great choice for the patient to have in such a severe setting. So I think it was the classical spectrum that we have seen. We saw obviously quite a positive stock market overall, up 30% now for us in a portfolio. Nasdaq Biotech Index, for example, up as well in the low 20s. So we have seen overall, I would say, positive results that has been impacted by the COVID names, but actually a very broad number of clinical trial. We are probably getting close to a record number of product approvals in 2020, once again, meaning the regulatory authorities have been very active next to the COVID projects that obviously have had the limelight. So we think all in all, the industry is very strongly positioned. Capital markets have done well. IPOs have gone well. Secondaries have been at the almost record number. So I think the industry is in a really strong seat here as well for 2021 and the years to come.
Great. That sounds almost like there hasn't been a global pandemic disrupting everything that we know. But so, I mean, despite that quite positive and driving forward clinical and regulatory backdrop, what's been the biggest challenge for you at BB Biotech in the past year?
Yeah, I think it's all the way from what we all experience privately in terms of how can we go to work, how can we work in this environment. So I think the pandemic obviously has, from an internal perspective, has affected us in terms of how we work. So all the medical meetings, company interactions, client interaction that we had all turned virtual. So I think that was a big shift, and I personally at least missed the interaction, and said I'm hopeful that second half of 2021, latest by 2022, hopefully we have a more normalized situation, that one. And this then drove all the way down to what we saw obviously in our portfolio in the stock market, having the very high volatility in Q1. So we saw a sell-off in pretty much all the equity markets because of uncertainty driven by lockdowns. We saw a Q2 rebound and then Q3 consolidation. I think when people start to reflect and dissect what that all means and what actually is happening with the Q4 now being an up move again. We saw this all the way with currency fluctuation. So we saw there quite a challenging overall year with, I would say, a lot of uncertainty, risks, volatility, and short-term driven headlines that obviously are for us as a long-term and long-only investor, making at least, I would say, an overall challenging environment as such. And we saw that translate all the way into the portfolio. So the pandemic had influence. We saw the obvious winners, if you can call them like this, that benefited directly from what's going on, all the way from the diagnostics company, life science tools company, all the way to the drug development companies that are directly engaged in COVID-19. But we saw as well that companies that have other areas and disease areas that struggled. And you can start there because the lockdown driving patients away from physician visits, mostly or most extreme seen, for example, in psychiatry indications, seeing as well in elderly care, meaning osteoporosis patient that say, we have a chronic condition, but it's not so severe. I don't feel it. So I just push everything out. And I think that will have really substantial consequences as well for the year to come. And for us, I would say it was a big difference we have seen in the portfolio between newer investments that have gone mostly pretty well, some of them actually very well, and then the longer term holdings that have products in the market that are, I think, in a good cycle where investors kind of like struggle a bit more in terms of seeing where's the short-term upside and the momentum. So we saw there, I think, a real change or difference in terms of behavior between momentum stocks and what we would say more fundamental, more established player. And I think that for us as a long-term hold as well brought the challenge that what works in the portfolio in the short term, shall we adapt, yes or no? And we, as said, reflected constantly on our own DNA and our own success of the past and said we want to have a balanced portfolio of established players as well as obviously the new players and the up-running companies that we have. And I think the blend nevertheless worked quite well, but it was not an easy year. I think we are glad where we stand. And I said, the most important, to bring it back to your first question, was I said, I think the vaccines really triggered that we have at least, light at the end of the tunnel, in a sense that we have not just from us and our portfolio, but I think for whole societies or global society, actually the chance or actually the positiveness and said the outlook that second half 2021, 2022, whenever it's going to be. We don't have the crystal ball. We hopefully have at least a good shot at getting back to normality, and I think that's as important as it gets, and that's I think exemplary as well, how positive and constructive here the industry has worked once again.
Thank you. So, I mean, building on that that sort of positive looking ahead platform, what have you seen as your biggest successes this year?
I think it's that the reward is always, if you do investment, and sometimes that can be as well, I won't say misleading, but can be too flattering almost. So for example, the investments we have done over the last 1 or 2 years, the last 12 to 18 months, most of them have done really well in the stock market. Many of them still have the major milestones ahead of themselves. So for example, we did 4 investments in the first 9 months of this year. That was Generation Bio, was Relay, Black Diamond, so 3 IPOs that we joined. They have gone really well in the stock market, but as said, as a small disclaimer, we wait for the milestones and the major milestones to come and to unblind in 2021 and 2022. So that will be for us as a longer term holder, obviously key. We have been glad that we joined Fate Therapeutics in the first quarter of this year. Said now seeing all the progress on the platform has been really rewarding. Moderna as such, I think, has been exemplary for us. That was our only private equity investment we have done over the last plus minus 10 years. So we invested in Moderna back in January 2018 when the company was private, because we saw the huge promise for, as its messenger RNA as a disruptive technology to be a so-called gain-of-function technology that allows to produce these protein and to function within the patient or the healthy person in the sense of a prophylactic vaccine. And that now has been translated exemplary with the company and with management team, that they started off in January or mid-January with the sequence, and by, I would say, second half of December, we're going to have the first approved product for the company as such. We saw as well a Halozyme, a rebalance of the business case, actually refocusing back on the delivery and the partnerships that they have done. So I said we have seen quite a lot of, I would say, very positive cases. And that, I said, overall has triggered, that I said the portfolio is year to date up 30%. I think that's quite rewarding, but I think that's far from where we could be, because said we had as well one or the other case where we had hoped for a better outcome, at least on a short-term basis. But we are quite optimistic, I said, for 2021 and 2022 and forward years.
Thank you. So just building on that then, we are talking about vaccines, and I believe today the first patients have been receiving the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine in the UK, which almost gives us the ability to look ahead to perhaps not a post-COVID world, but a post-COVID pandemic world. And how are you at BB Biotech looking ahead to that?
Yeah. So I think I said it's key because, we had as well some questions, at least early in the year, where people said, why don't you invest further and broader into the COVID universe? And we said, we see it as very important what's going on, but we see certain challenges in many of the business models, or recurring and long-term business models. And that's why we actually, in broad sense, next to Moderna, actually stuck to our portfolio approach per se. And the challenge we see is that, and I touched on this already a little bit, that in the healthcare system, a lot of the current resource allocation, being it people, resources, capital, regulatory authorities, the political engagement, etc., is driven to solve, as I said, the pandemic. And this drives a disbalance on many other areas that we see actually as long and midterm opportunities. We have already investments there. We will continue to invest in these, and these are set, for example, the chronic conditions. And I think we will see a resurfacing and probably an acceleration of diagnosis once again, as soon as I said patients and people go back to meet and I said test themselves in terms of physician interaction, etc. That we're going to see a reacceleration in certain areas where we have seen a slowdown, for example, in the last 6 months. And I mentioned already psychiatry indication. take osteoporosis as an example. We heard many of the oncology company actually call out some worries, saying the patients don't test themselves. Early diagnosis happening less. That will drive a shift in how actually the patient population is going to look like, at least from the de novo patient population in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, where you're going to have a shift for later stage, for example, cancer patient that should have tested earlier or be found earlier. So I think I said that's something we care about. And we said we look as well into, are there so-called comorbidities coming out of COVID-19? So what about these potential long-term implications for lung or heart tissue? Is that even an investment opportunity? Meaning, will we have new patient populations out there that we can consider as potential targeted patient population for having new solutions in that area? And that's for us, for example, a continuum to say we want to invest and do due diligence as well in the cardiovascular space, which, for example, is precisely looking as well into this field. We can't say yet we have found them, but we continue to look for. And I said, I think the consequences are very broad, very often very positive. I said, digitalization has been an effect that took some time in terms of how do you launch drug in such an environment. That means we're going to see a change from the industry, going away from these expensive sales force models more into a digital world as such, but will take some time. Same is true for patient screening and how to run clinical trials in such an environment on an ongoing basis. So I think we've seen a lot of pluses and acceleration and benefits, and we have to balance out and understand where are the risks. But overall, I would say, I think the industry has really excelled in this challenging time. And I said, we think the innovation cycle is almost, or we think at the highest ever or the fastest ever. And if you're right there to pick, I said, the right technologies, the right assets and the right companies, we think that's going to be quite positive. And I said, we all look forward to the post-pandemic world where hopefully COVID is more an endemic situation. That's the chance, I said, for even the vaccines in the future to play a very important role. And that's, for example, something I said where I think the pandemic has really triggered a reshift back to certain mass indication. I said prophylactic vaccine was, for example, excluded in most investors' universe in terms of saying that's not an attractive business model. Just a couple of big pharma players can make this successful. I think you see there already a shift, how that is changing and how the perception changes, and that population health becomes a bigger role than just, the ultra individualized world we have lived in. And that's something I said that we, from more top-down level, consider in the portfolio. But I said we're very optimistic that the industry has not only stepped up for the last 12 months, but will continue to do so on a forward basis.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's certainly been an extraordinary year, and we look forward to seeing how BB Biotech navigates the challenges of the coming period. Thank you again for joining us today on this Edison audio. I've been Sarah Godfrey from Edison, and you've been listening to Daniel Koller from BB Biotech. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sarah.